Public Safety Minister Bill Blair announcing a joint investigation by the Correctional Service of Canada and the Parole Board following the death of 22-year-old Marylène Lévesque. The sex worker was killed in a hotel room near Quebec City last week. The accused, Eustacio Galese, turned himself into police and has been charged with second-degree murder. Keep in mind, he has only been charged and not convicted, but Galese had received a life sentence without parole for 15 years for killing his partner in 2004 and was released on day parole last March. This case is bringing renewed attention to the current state of prisoner release and laws around Canada's sex workers. The Sunday Scrum is here to discuss. Susan, John, Vicky, and Tasha. Vicky, do you want to start us off?
Brings up for me a number of things. I think there's a lot of really good questions to ask around how corrections deals with parole, but most striking for me is the level of danger that sex workers in Canada are still in, despite successive rulings in their favor from the Supreme Court and from a government that claimed that they would govern in their best interest and has done nothing in that direction. So there are bills that still make it impossible to illegal for sex workers to advertise their services on their own, which makes it impossible for them to regulate their own safety. There are American bills that have effectively made it impossible for them to do the same and continue that pattern. And so they're still in the same holding pattern. And unfortunately, this is, at least part of the equation that leads to this tragic scenario. And I think it requires us asking, going back to the last section, asking someone like Peter MacKay why his government participated in creating these circumstances.
I'm going to date myself here, but I did interviews with advocates and women in the sex industry in the 1980s saying and asking for exactly the same thing that you're talking about now. Vicky Tasha, what's your take on this situation?
Well, first of all, it is a horrible failure of the corrections system. And it goes to Vicky's point, because what the corrections system here, what the members of that board were trying to do, allegedly, was reintegrate Mr. Galese into society or pave the way for his reintegration. How did they do that? They allowed him to visit massage parlors and have sexual relations with sex workers. Why did they do that? Because they didn't want him to form a relationship with a woman who presumably was not a sex worker, which would put her in danger of the same kind of danger he put his former partner in, i.e. he killed her 15 years ago or 14 years ago.
Stabbed and killed her with a hammer.
With a hammer. I was going to say the method of death was horrible. So here basically we're considering these women to be the sex workers second class, I guess, disposable. In fact, the commentary in Quebec, in the Quebec press, was that these women were being used to safeguard other women. And that is a horrible, horrible thing. Like I said, there's so many layers of questions here, but obviously the level of respect for the sex worker was completely absent. And here, it's not just the changes to the laws around sex workers that could be discussed, but the very attitudes that this parole board had. It was supposed to be safeguarding the well-being of women in general from this man.
Every aspect of this case is disturbing as you read through it. Virtually every line of it has something that could potentially upset someone as the facts are presented. Susan, your take?
My take is that a lot of the problem is rooted in the fact that as Vicky pointed out, that it's illegal to pay for sex, but it's not illegal to be a sex worker. This is as a result of legislation brought in by the Conservatives in 2014. I think with the intention of not criminalizing the women, but rather criminalizing their clients. That at least is the way they perceived it. The result, though, is that if you are a sex worker working in a brothel or a hotel or something, and there's a sexual psychopath circulating around and coming in and trying to get dates, you can't report it to the police because the police will come and shut you down. So you lose your income. So you're trapped, and you're made more vulnerable. That wasn't the intention, certainly, but it ends up that sex workers are made more vulnerable. The Liberals came in promising to change this, to improve this, to get rid of this. They haven't really done anything. Here's the problem, though. When these kind of tragedies happen, the primary victims obviously are the people who are killed and their families, but the government, in whoever it might be, conservative, liberal, whomever, are blamed by citizens. They're this responsibility. The blame is focused on them, and yet parole boards are meant to operate independently of political and other concerns. Well, it's a real conundrum. And beyond, sorry, yeah?
No, go ahead. I was going to say that There is an issue around the appointees to this parole board, and in fact, that is one of the things that's going to be looked at, is that a number of parole board appointees most of them actually had no experience with the board. The government made a bit of a clean slate, got rid of a lot of people who did have experience, didn't create the usual mix, and that has been a discussion in the Quebec press as well of why this happened. So the government's being looked at in that sense. Maybe there is a responsibility of the government as to what people were thinking on that board.
John, what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, well, so the first point is that any suggestion that there is a politicization of the parole board is something that has to be looked at really hard. The people on this board should be there on merit, on the basis of experience and qualification, not because they're good liberals or because they contribute money to the Conservative Party or anything else. Secondly, why was this man on parole? There is this expectation, this presumption that people who are convicted of heinous crimes must eventually be reintegrated into society. Why? This man had been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years. He was deemed to be at least a moderate risk of reoffend. The parole board was trying to find ways to integrate him back into society while satisfying his sexual urges. Why not just throw him back in jail and throw away the key? One life would have been saved if they had done that. I do not understand the presumption of the need to reintegrate offenders back into society when in fact the safest thing to do for the preservation and the protection of society would be to keep these men behind bars for as long as they live.
And the recidivism rate among, sexual predators and pedophiles is higher than the normal population, number one. Number two, there's a massive inconsistency, maybe because human nature is inconsistent, but Paul Bernardo, for example, will never walk the streets again. He'll never be a threat to anybody again, because his crime was infamous, because it was so well publicized. There's a number of sort of garden variety sexual predators within prisons right now, and each of them is treated differently, and it really depends on the competence of each parole officer and parole board what happens.
Well, with the investigation underway, we will keep an eye on it, and we will bring it up again depending on what they find. But that's all the time we have for that part of the conversation. As always, though, you can get involved in the debate. You can tweet me at jnorthcottcbc. Just remember to use the hashtag #SundayScrum. And our panelists always up for a good discussion. They can be reached at Susan P. Riley, at John Ibbotson, at V. Mochama, and at Tasha Carradine.